Zainab Mensah had everything: power, wealth, beauty. She was the youngest billionaire in the country, a woman who built an empire with her own hands, turning her real estate business into a dynasty. Men admired her, envied her, wanted her, but she wanted none of them. Love was a distraction, a weakness she couldn't afford. She had seen too many women lose themselves in romance, letting their emotions cloud their judgment. She had vowed never to be one of them. Her heart was locked away, guarded by walls taller than the skyscrapers she owned. That was why she barely looked at the man standing in front of her now, the new hire, Kwame. She only glanced at his resume before handing it over to her HR team, trusting them to make the right choice. Kwame was an ordinary man, dressed simply in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks. His skin was a deep, rich brown, his frame tall and sturdy, but he carried himself with an easy confidence, like someone who didn't feel the need to prove anything. Unlike most men she met, he didn't look nervous in her presence. He didn't stumble over his words, try to impress her, or act as if standing before Zainab Mensah was an honor. Instead, he gave a small nod and said, "Good morning, Miss Mensah. I hear you run a tight ship." She arched a brow, slightly taken aback by the casual tone. "I expect excellence." "Good. That makes two of us." Something about the way he said it, with no arrogance, just quiet certainty, made her pause. Most employees, especially men, tried too hard in her presence. They either bent over backward to please her or strutted around pretending they could match her power. Kwame did neither. He was just himself. She dismissed the thought. It didn't matter. He was an employee, nothing more. The days passed, and Kwame settled into his role. He wasn't loud or attention-seeking, but he was efficient. He worked hard, never made excuses, and didn't involve himself in office politics. That alone was unusual. Most people in her company were always angling for her attention, hoping to climb higher. But Kwame, he treated everyone the same, whether it was the janitor or the senior executives. He joked easily with the security guards, helped a new intern without being asked, and somehow never seemed stressed, even when given a mountain of tasks. At first, Zainab barely noticed. Then, one evening, as she walked past the main office, she saw something that made her pause. One of the junior employees, Sandra, the timid young woman, was being spoken down to by a senior manager. His voice was low, but sharp, filled with condescension. Kwame, who had been nearby, stepped in without hesitation. "That's enough." His tone was calm, not aggressive, but there was an authority in it that made the older man stop. The manager scoffed. "Mind your business. This office is my business, and I don't like seeing people being treated unfairly." Sandra looked like she wanted to sink into the ground, but Kwame didn't back down. He didn't yell, didn't threaten, he simply stood his ground. And strangely, it worked. The manager backed off, muttering something under his breath before walking away. Zainab should have just moved along. But she didn't. She found herself watching Kwame. He didn't turn to Sandra expecting thanks. He just gave her a small nod and walked off as if nothing had happened. That was the first time she truly noticed him. From that moment, she became more aware of him. Not intentionally. At least, that's what she told herself. She told herself it was nothing when she overheard him talking to an older employee about his sick mother and offering to cover his shift so he could visit her. She told herself it didn't matter when she saw how people naturally gravitated toward him, drawn to his steady energy. She told herself it didn't mean anything when he made her laugh one morning. It had been a stressful day, meetings piling up, endless decisions to make. She had been walking through the hallway when Kwame passed by, balancing 2 coffee cups. "You look like you need this more than me," he said, handing one to her without hesitation. Zainab blinked, caught off guard. She took the cup automatically. How do you know how I take my coffee? He shrugged. I pay attention. She didn't know why that answer made something in her chest tighten. She raised the cup to her lips, took a sip, and immediately coughed. This is awful. Kwame laughed, a rich, deep sound. That's because I didn't actually know. I just guessed. For the first time in years, Zainab laughed. A real, unguarded laugh. It startled her. More than that, it scared her. She avoided him after that. She tried to brush it off. It was nothing. He was just an employee. But why did she keep thinking about him? Why did his voice stay in her head long after the workday ended? Why did she find herself noticing small things, how he rolled his sleeves up when working late, how his presence made the office feel calmer, how he never treated her like a billionaire but just as a person? Zainab Mensah did not get distracted. Not by men. Not by emotions. And yet she was. It frustrated her. It confused her. But most of all, it terrified her. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't in control. Zainab Mensah did not have crushes. She did not like people in a way that distracted her. Yet, no matter how much she told herself otherwise, she couldn't deny what was happening. Kwame Asidu had managed to carve a space in her mind, and she hated it. It wasn't because he was charming or overly impressive. In fact, he did nothing to impress her. That was the problem. He was just himself, steady, kind, and unbothered by the things that made other men fawn over her. He didn't compliment her wealth. He didn't try to get close to her. And that was exactly why she couldn't stop thinking about him. She told herself she needed to focus, so she buried herself in work. Meetings. Deals. Late nights at the office. Anything to push aside the ridiculous feelings growing inside her. But fate seemed determined to test her. One evening, she left her office late, heading to the elevator. As she approached, she heard familiar voices. Kwame. And someone else, a woman. Zainab wasn't eavesdropping. Of course not. She just happened to stop for a moment. Kwame, you're really not interested in dating. Not even a little. The woman's voice was playful, teasing. Nope, Kwame answered easily. Relationships are complicated. Oh, come on, the woman pressed. There's no one who's caught your eye. Someone you secretly like. There was a pause. Even if I did, it wouldn't matter. Zainab's chest tightened. Why not? Because she's out of my league. Zainab felt something strange at those words. A flicker of frustration. Who was he talking about? She didn't wait to hear more. She stepped forward, the sound of her heels cutting through the air. The two employees looked up quickly. The woman, one of the HR associates, gave a nervous smile before excusing herself. Zainab's eyes locked on Kwame. Out of your league, she asked, arching a brow. Kwame chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. You were listening. You were speaking loudly. He gave her an amused look, then shrugged. It's true. Something in her snapped. That's a coward's excuse. His brows lifted slightly. A coward's excuse. Yes, she said, stepping closer. You're saying it doesn't matter, but the truth is, you're afraid. If you liked someone, really liked them, you wouldn't let leagues stop you. Kwame studied her for a moment, then smiled. Is that so? Yes. He nodded. Then what about you, Miss Mensah? Is there someone you like? Her breath caught. She wasn't expecting the question to be turned back on her. No. It was a lie. A terrible, obvious lie. Kwame's lips twitched as if he knew. But he didn't press further. Instead, he simply said, "Good night, Miss Mensah." And then, just like that, he walked away, leaving her standing there. Frustrated. Confused. And more drawn to him than ever. She avoided him again after that. Or at least, she tried. But the problem with having feelings for someone was that you started noticing everything. She noticed how his sleeves were always rolled up by noon, exposing strong forearms. She noticed how he always carried an extra pen because someone in the office was bound to lose theirs. She noticed how his presence made everything seem easier, how people naturally leaned toward him in meetings, how he never sought power yet somehow held it effortlessly. And then there was the moment that changed everything. It was late one night. Zainab had been working non-stop, barely eating, pushing through exhaustion. When she finally stood from her desk, her vision blurred, and she had to grip the table to steady herself. Then, a voice. "Sit down." She looked up to see Kwame standing at her door. She had no idea how long he had been there. "I don't take orders from employees," she said, straightening. He ignored her, stepping inside. "You haven't eaten all day." She scoffed. "And you know this how?" "Because I've been watching." Her pulse quickened. "Watching?" He sighed, placing a container on her desk. "Relax. I'm not stalking you. You just work too much." She stared at the container. "You bought me food." "No. I made it." Zainab blinked. "You cook?" "Of course." She hesitated. "I don't eat food from just anyone." Kwame smirked. "Then starve." She narrowed her eyes. "Excuse me. I don't have time to convince you, Miss Mensah. Eat, or don't. But don't pass out in your office and expect someone to carry you home." With that, he turned and left. Zainab sat there, stunned. Then, slowly, she opened the container. The aroma hit her immediately: jollof rice, grilled chicken, plantains. Her stomach growled. She picked up a fork, took a bite, and froze. It was good. Too good. She should have stopped eating. She should have been annoyed. Instead, she found herself smiling. For the first time, she admitted the truth. She liked Kwame. And she had no idea what to do about it. Zainab Mensah had never been one to hesitate. She was a woman who made decisions quickly and efficiently. But when it came to Kwame Asidu, hesitation had become her constant companion. She told herself it was just a passing distraction. She would eventually lose interest, and things would return to normal. But interest didn't fade. It grew. She found herself seeking him out in meetings, waiting for his thoughts on business strategies. She noticed how his eyes lit up when he spoke passionately about ideas. She realized she enjoyed hearing his voice, deep, calm, and confident. And then, the worst part, she started caring. One evening, she saw him in the office, rubbing his temples, looking exhausted. Without thinking, she sent an intern to bring him coffee. When the intern returned, Kwame refused it. "I didn't ask for coffee," he said, pushing it aside. The intern hesitated. "Miss Mensah sent it." Kwame paused, then sighed. He picked up the cup and took a sip. And Zainab, watching from a distance, felt a ridiculous rush of satisfaction. That was when she knew she was in serious trouble. Zainab was not used to feeling vulnerable. So, as she fought back against her emotions the only way she knew how, she tried to avoid him. She delegated tasks to others, ensuring she wouldn't have to speak to him often. She left meetings early before he could linger and talk to her. She reminded herself that relationships were distractions, and distractions were weaknesses. It didn't work. Because Kwame didn't care about her avoiding him. He wasn't the kind of man who would chase her or demand her attention. He didn't flirt or try to impress her. He went on with his life as if nothing was happening. And for some reason, that made Zainab furious. Didn't he feel anything? Did he really see her as just another boss, just another powerful woman who meant nothing to him? The idea bothered her more than it should. Then came the night everything changed. Zainab attended a high-profile charity gala in Accra filled with the wealthiest and most influential figures in business. She arrived in a stunning emerald green dress, her confidence unshaken, her beauty unmatched. She had planned to network, secure deals, and enjoy the night. What she didn't expect was to see Kwame there. He wasn't dressed in his usual office attire. Instead, he wore a sharp black suit that fit him too well. He stood among a group of men, speaking with ease, his laughter rich and genuine. He didn't see her at first. And that annoyed her. So she made sure he did. She walked past his group slowly, elegantly, making sure he caught sight of her. And when his gaze finally landed on her, something flashed in his eyes. Surprise. Admiration. Something else. But just as quickly, he hid it, giving her nothing more than a polite nod. Nothing more. And for the first time in her life, Zainab felt unnoticed. Unseen. She hated it. So she did something she never thought she would do. She approached him. I didn't know you attended events like this. Kwame turned at the sound of her voice, raising a brow. Good evening, Miss Mensah. She studied him. Are you here for business? He smiled. No. A friend invited me. She didn't like that answer. Because it meant he had a life outside of work. It meant he wasn't just an employee in her world, he was a man who had his own world, his own life, his own priorities. And she wasn't part of them. Before she could respond, a young woman walked up beside him, linking her arm with his. A beautiful woman. Tall. Graceful. Smiling. Kwame, I was looking for you, she said sweetly. Zainab felt a strange, unexpected sting. She had no right to be jealous. But she was. Kwame glanced at Zainab. If he noticed her sudden stiffness, he didn't acknowledge it. Miss Mensah, this is Amma, an old friend. Amma smiled warmly. Oh, so you're Zainab. Kwame talks about you often. Zainab's eyes snapped to Kwame. Does he? Amma nodded. Yes. He always says you're one of the sharpest business minds he's worked with. That should have made Zainab feel proud. It didn't. Because why did she suddenly care about what Kwame thought of her? The rest of the night was hell. She couldn't focus on anything. She couldn't stop watching them, Kwame and Amma, talking, laughing, existing in a space where she did not belong. And that was the moment she snapped. She wasn't the type of woman to sit back and wonder. She was Zainab Mensah. A woman who took what she wanted. And at that moment, she wanted Kwame. The next morning, she did something reckless. She called him to her office. When he arrived, she didn't waste time. Are you dating her? Kwame frowned. What? Amma. Are you dating her? He looked taken aback. That's none of your business. Zainab's jaw tightened. It is if I want you. Silence. A thick, electrifying silence. Kwame's expression shifted, his usual calm exterior cracking slightly. What are you saying? Zainab exhaled, stepping forward. I don't like playing games. I don't know when it happened, or how, but I like you, Kwame. And I don't want to waste time pretending I don't. He stared at her. Then, slowly, he spoke. You are like me. Yes. He let out a breath, rubbing his jaw. You know this is crazy, right? She smirked. I don't do normal. He chuckled, shaking his head. No, you don't. Then his expression grew serious. Zainab. Are you sure about this? She nodded. And for the first time since she had met him, Kwame looked at her differently. Not as his boss. Not as the untouchable billionaire. But as a woman he could want. Zainab had made her move. Now, the game had changed. But Kwame. He didn't react the way most men would. He didn't look thrilled that a billionaire wanted him. He didn't look intimidated either. He just stood there, watching her, considering her words like a businessman weighing a deal. And that infuriated her. Say something, she demanded. Kwame exhaled. Zainab, you're my boss. So, this is reckless. Zainab smirked. I told you, I don't do normal. Kwame's eyes darkened, something unreadable flickering behind them. You don't do love either. That caught her off guard. What? He stepped closer. You're Zainab Mensah. The woman who built an empire without distractions. Without attachments. And now, suddenly, you want me. He searched her face. What happens when you get bored? Zainab's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected him to be the one testing her. I don't get bored, she said. Prove it. The next few weeks became a battle. Zainab, the woman who had never chased anyone, found herself pursuing Kwame. She sent him morning texts. He replied hours later. She invited him to private dinners. He showed up, sometimes. She tried to seduce him. He never let things go too far. And it drove her crazy. But it also made her fall harder. Because Kwame wasn't impressed by her money. He wasn't moved by her power. He wanted her to be real. And for the first time in her life, Zainab wanted to be. One night, she found him alone in the office, working late. She walked in, placing a takeout box on his desk. Eat. He looked up, amused. Bossy. She smirked. Rich. He chuckled, opening the box. Silence settled between them as he took a bite. Then, softly, he asked, why me, Zainab? She hesitated. Then she answered truthfully. Because you make me feel human. Kwame stilled. He put down his fork, his eyes locking onto hers. Then, finally, he stood up, closing the space between them. If we do this, Zainab, I won't be one of your trophies. Her heart pounded. I don't want a trophy. I want you. And then, he kissed her. Zainab had spent years making the hardest deals of her life. But this was the biggest gamble she'd ever taken. And it had just paid off. Kwame kissed her, not like a man who had been waiting for this, but like a man who had been holding back something dangerous, something deep. His lips moved against hers with the kind of certainty that made Zainab's heart race. For once, she wasn't in control. And she didn't want to be. The world took notice. When news broke that Zainab Mensah, Africa's most powerful billionaire, was dating a man who was once just her employee, the headlines went wild. Cinderella story. Some mocked. A power move. Others speculated. Zainab didn't care. She had spent her life proving herself in boardrooms, crushing competition, and building an empire. Now, for the first time, she was doing something for herself. Kwame stayed the same. He didn't bask in the spotlight. He didn't demand anything from her. He just stood by her side like he always had, solid, unshaken. And that was what made her love him more. Yes. Love. The word terrified her. It wasn't supposed to happen. Yet here she was, staring at this man, knowing she didn't want to live without him. One evening, they were at his apartment, far from the glitz and glamour of her world. No security, no press, no luxury. Just them. Zainab turned to him. "Marry me." Kwame paused, blinking. "What? You heard me." He let out a slow breath. "Zainab, are you sure?" She met his gaze. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." A slow, knowing smile spread across his lips. And then, for the first time ever, Kwame let her win. Then, yes. The wedding was small, intimate, and perfect. No flashy billionaire event. No grand display of wealth. Just family, friends, and love. Zainab walked down the aisle in a stunning ivory gown, her heart pounding, not with nerves, but with certainty. And at the altar, Kwame stood, watching her with that same steady, unshaken expression. She had spent her life making power moves. But choosing him. That was her greatest success.